Well, I may be a little too the mom and pop that I support around the corner. She had knee replacement, so they're now not open on Sundays. So I'm like, and the place across the street doesn't open until 8. I gotta get back because I'm gonna be late.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, thank you all for being here. And today we're talking about the return of the sacred in an age of terror. That's the essay, and this is part 2. So if you missed part 1, you can find the replay of it last week. I'm reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, Volume 2, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arst. And so what we're talking about is the mystery of life, and something we don't understand. As we talked about at one point in a book called The Tree of Life by Israel Regardie, in 6 words, he's summarized what we need to do. And that is that nature is the magical agent. And so we're talking about ancient magic, but ancient magic is really nature. And the nature in all of us is an instinct for the religious aspect of life, which Dr. Jung identified, and it was the sort of the fundamental cause of his break with Sigmund Freud, because Freud was a reductionist, so he wanted to explain everything logically by the logos. And unfortunately, you cannot do that because there's nothing alive in the logos. The logos is in all the things in our lives. My coffee cup, for example, and everything that is in your room. We need the logos to make things, but none of those things are alive. Your life is in the Eros side, and the Eros has been dissed for hundreds of years, centuries, millennia, by the Christian Church, and so we've been forced into this idea that the logos is all there is. And so we have the passage in the book of John: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But no, God isn't a word. Okay, God is something else. And the book of John says that 4 verses later, when it says, in him was the light and the life. It says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Or let's see, verse John 1:4, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. And so we have to understand that it's life that is the light of the world, and we have to recover that.
I have a comment there on it. Doesn't go counter grain at all, but it supports it from another angle, that in the beginning, the Word, capital W, Word, was with God. That's the voice, the inner divinity, the voice of God, and then it emanates. So even then, the Word comes into logos from God, but becomes Eros within us as our divine voice. Right. So that just further supports, even if the Word didn't exist before.
The logos is the structure upon which we have built civilization,
right?
Because we can tell somebody that's building a building. Now you put this brick here and you put this brick here, and then you can build up your building. So that's very logical and so on. But you're not making life, you're creating a building, which is a structure.
Well, and then that logos contains space. And architecturally, that space then is the Eros, because the space is what has the feel and the resonance. And here you go, within. So there's another metaphor for the inner nature in architecture.
Right. Okay, that's a great one. And so, okay, so I'm going to read on. I'm reading from David Tacey's essay entitled The Return of the Sacred in the Age of Terror. And I'm going to read this paragraph by paragraph, and we can discuss each paragraph. We'll see how far we get.
Right.
Because it precisely explains January 6th. So I'll go on. In Ion, Jung wrote, quote, that the erstwhile symbols no longer express what is now welling up from the unconscious as the end result of the development of Christian consciousness through the centuries. That is what the post-Christian spirit looks like. And he commented that it looks anything other than holy. He said the sacred had been suppressed for so long, it had become contaminated with murky contents that have washed through it during its exile in the unconscious. When it returns, it will do so as a torrent, unruly with anger and wrath. And then, quote, the opening of the unconscious always means the outbreak of intense spiritual suffering. It is as when fertile fields are exposed by the bursting of a dam to a raging torrent. So,
well, that directly speaks. I mean, it will resurge with a torrent. And I'll stick to my architectural theme for a moment, and that's I'll up the scale of a personal trauma being triggered that rages up, and the person triggering it has no responsibility to receive such a huge torrent of something for the small thing that they did. And so then here's then the sacred that has been suppressed, and then it, like a volcano, wells up, flows out in the torrent, as they mentioned, and that surge, and then we get in insurrection and insurgency, literally, with that surge.
Right. So so what built up in all those people, mostly men, on the attack on our capital was a deep resentment because life, society, etc., had taken away their means of a livelihood. Okay, and so it's instinctual for men to provide a home for their families. And so we see it at a very basic level in other beings. So I'll go back to my metaphor of the osprey. Okay, an osprey male has to do three things. Okay, and it has a specific instinctual job, three things it has to do. The osprey comes back to the north in the springtime. And the first thing it has to do is it has to build a nest. Okay, and so that nest is instinctual, and it has a certain kind. Over centuries, it's learned to build its nest on day marks. Okay, on things like buoys and boats that are out moored in the harbor, things like that. In fact, we have a law in Maryland that if an osprey builds a nest on your boat, you're not allowed to destroy that nest. You have to leave it there until the osprey family is born and fledges. And so the osprey male instinctually builds a nest, and males in every species create a home for their families. Okay, number two, they have to do a sky dance. Okay, so an osprey does a sky dance, which is flying around, showing off. It's why male birds are often very colorful, because it attracts the attention of the female. And this goes back very, very deep in antiquity. So I've talked about the fugu fish before, but I'll just very quickly show this, because this species separated from human beings. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, the pufferfish, the fugu fish.
Okay, so the fugu fish makes this mandala, okay, and that attracts the female. So he's showing off. He can make a perfect mandala, and then the female comes and she puts her eggs right in the middle of that mandala, and so here you can see him doing it. And human beings separated from this species, according to my friend Gray Yates, we separated from this species about 200 million years ago. And so here's the fugu fish doing it, in effect, creating a nest or a mandala.
Also in support of the male creating the home for the female, whether it's male or the partner of the one who's giving birth, however, it goes these days. You take the woman who has the home of the womb that creates life, and she's the vessel for the home of the womb of life. And then he creates a vessel around her to vessel the womb of life and protect that in the vessel of the world. So you get a cascading scale of the onion skinning, or the Russian nesting dolls are a really good image metaphor of how the vessel around the vessel around the vessel, goes back and forth, front and back, side to side through its scales.
We're all in some sort of nest. Anybody that's watching this right now, we're all in a place of safety where we can watch our YouTube and feel safe. And
even if someone's out in the park, they're in the vessel of the screen where we have all come together. So there's even an abstract that supports that also.
Yeah, civilization where if you're in Central Park, typically, unless you're out there running in the dark, which is obviously a stupid thing to do, but if you're out there during the day, the police are defending you. So that's a part of the vessel too. And so the second, after creating the nest, the male has to attract the attention of the female. So typically what happens in the human species is the male finds a woman that is attractive to him for some reason, okay, and that's for me, with my wife Debbie, I realized almost instantly that she was my soulmate, okay, and that we created such a strong bond. And I left my first wife to be with Debbie, and I had been with my first wife for 17 years, and yet I had an email exchange with Debbie, and this is back in 1985, before anybody was meeting people online. But I met Debbie online, and so we say that we're the first couple to meet online and marry, and nobody's disputed that claim. And so, but what happened was.
That was even pre-vax. So, I mean, it's the vax really wasn't publicly available either.
Yeah,
so
that's right. And so there were email networks. And so she and I started to exchange emails. And in 4 months, I felt like I knew Debbie far better than I knew my first wife of 17 years. So I've been living with one woman for 17 years, and in 4 months, just by exchanging emails, and we only physically were together 4 times in that 4 months. And on the, I think it was on the 3rd time we met in London, and I asked her to marry me. Okay. And that
1, 2, 3.
And that was 6 weeks into the whole process.
Well, there's the vessel of connection that, for example, in a cathedral, the choir is always behind in a traditional European cathedral. It's unseen. You do not see the people singing. And so and then you get on the other end, the big rose window, which is the voice of God and light. So when they're singing, you are hearing the voice of God and light. And if you look at a lot of modern architectural ecclesiastical structures, the choir is up in the pulpit. We see this God. It is real. It's a logos choir. So even that supports, whereas you two had then the Eros of the vessel of communication that brought forth the life of the marriage.
Right. Okay. So so the way I did the sky dance with Debbie was I saw she had seen she had put 7 interests into the email network that we were working on, and one of them was Japanese language. And so I've had a lot of people say to me that they could speak Japanese, and I always just say doku desu benkyou shimashita ka, which means where did you study? And you know, most people go, oh, you know, they don't understand those words. And so I wrote a short message to Debbie in Japanese to check her out. And she sent me to her dictionary, and then I knew I was in trouble. She sent me to my dictionary, and then I knew I was in trouble, right?
Well, it's funny, even the word study and learn is not a normal day-to-day conversation at a lower level. I don't want to minimize it or demean it, but even just that sentence itself has words that come from a collegial or the department. You know, you get the military language school, and you're learning the language, not just how many burgers do I want, you know?
Right. So I can, it's like I could say to our friend Yuan here, Tian Bupa, Di Bupa, Jopa, Yangwei Tzu Shua Guan Hua. And she immediately knows a whole lot about me. In fact, I think I did say it to her originally when she first approached me, because
when she just unmuted, I wonder if she's going to respond.
I don't know. Maybe.
Oh, I just want to say your pronunciation is very good. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think my pronunciation has gone haywire over the last 50 years, because I studied Chinese Mandarin 50 years ago in language school. And at that time, I could speak to a Chinese person. If I was in Taiwan, where they speak Fujinhua, I could speak on the telephone, and they couldn't tell that I was American. They would think I was Beijing Ren. Because in way 我会说北京话. For example, 要是我用说饭馆，在台湾饭馆 is 饭馆. So if I want to say the word restaurant in Chinese, in Fukienese, which is the language of Taiwan, it's Fangguan, but in Beijing, it's Fangguar. And so
Fonglar. Okay.
Yeah. So, so a Fukienese Fukienese speaking individual on the telephone would just think I was a Chinese who's speaking another dialect of Chinese, which is Beijing language. It's like, hey y'all, how you doing today? You know, the way we in the South, we, you know.
And I'm from Texas, so that was a perfect example. Yeah, it's like,
right. And
I was allergic to the accent. I couldn't pick it. I could fake it, but I didn't pick it up.
But my poem that I just recited to Yuan, which I've known for 50 years, and it's the one thing that I for sure remember from Chinese. I was actually not taught in class. One day, my teacher, who had come from China at a time when China was not open, and it's a long story, and I'm not going to tell it for the benefit of Yuan, for Yuan's security, but she had taken us out on a picnic and said she was going to make Chinese food for the picnic. So we went out on the lawn, and she taught us this poem, which is Tian Bu Pa Di Bu Pa Zhou Pa Yang Gui Zi Shua Guan Hua. And it means don't fear heaven, don't fear hell, only feel fear. Well, I'll do the play way and then the in-play way. Only fear foreigners who speak Mandarin. But Yanguitsu actually means something like running dogs or something like that. I don't know.
So you get the cultural rift going on. Yeah, that's.
I mean, she didn't give us the translation of Yanguitsu. So,
well, when I first started learning Taekwondo, I was steeped in Japanese meditation and other things. And I remember one day I said something, and I was trying to be cute-ish, funny, and I ripped off something in Japanese, and my 8th degree grandmaster, Korean Taekwondo instructor, both eyebrows went up, and I saw he's going to eat me. And then he just turned around and he walked away and he didn't do anything, but I got home and I went, So I started looking in my history books. I'm like, oh, there's been a lot of warring between the Korean and the Japanese. I completely misspoke. And I had no idea, but I saw it in his eyes and went,
oh yeah.
I think I better learn something about what I say in the dojo now.
Yeah, it's really not it's really not wise to speak Japanese in Korean.
No, and I learned that, fortunately not terribly the hard way, but the look I got was terrifying.
Right. Because most Koreans do, at least older Koreans do speak Japanese, but oh my God, they really, never mind. Okay,
yeah,
going back now.
Same
so,
point. The running dogs comment.
So the sky dance is a way to gain the attention of a female, right? And so it's done with plumage. It's done with flying around in a very special way, which is what the osprey do because they're not colorful males. And then you have to bring the female a fish. The osprey has to bring the female a fish. And the point of that is it demonstrates that he knows that if she's going to have eggs and sit on them for 40 days until they hatch, she's not going to be able to feed herself. And so the male has to demonstrate that he'll feed her during that time. So it's 3 things. It's build the nest, build the residence, do the sky dance, and bring a fish. And so that's instinctual. And and I've talked about Anderson Cooper when he went to Paris and was interviewing older Muslim men about why young Muslim men in France would go to Al Qaeda. And the older men said, because they have no way to prove that they're a man. And, if I think about my time in the Marines, well, okay, what part of what I did was I joined the Marines to prove I was a man. And also I knew women would like the beautiful dress uniform of the Marine Corps. Of course, they don't tell you, which they do, okay, but what they don't tell you is that you have to serve 1,000 hours in the mud for every 1 hour that you serve in dress blue uniform. But the dress blue uniform does attract women. and so it's all part of that same instinctual stuff. And so
what's interesting about the uniform, because it's the colorful feathers, it's also strength, there's implied discipline and courage, and even just with the simple sight of the uniform, that person's been through the shit. So they odds are have a different calm around any kind of conflict. And so not that they don't have any, but there's just that the superficial aspect starts to play the story of this.
Yeah. So there's a motto in the Marine Corps: the Marine Corps builds men. And that's literally what it does, because it creates a certain maturity that I can't define. I can't speak to it. It's only Marines who know. And it's fellow Marines know one another in a very special way that can't be defined. Okay. And so, but it's a proof of manhood, and it's a proof of, courage, and it's attractive to females, right? That courage, that manhood, that the fancy uniform, etc. That's why the British used to use red uniforms. Right?
Well, and I think it's also the source of that "you clean up well." That that statement, because 1,000 hours in the mud, and then you come to the party, and there you are.
Yep, there
perfect,
you are,
right on point.
There you are.
You clean up well,
right? And
literally,
right, and Marines can tell exactly where you stand in the pecking order, except when you're in the field with one another. But when you're in garrison with one another, you know exactly where you stand in the pecking order, because you wear your rank on your shoulder, and you wear your resume on your chest in the form of ribbons and medals. So you can literally know where you stand in the pecking order and read your resume. when you're
right.
there.
No introductions necessary. Can all be done stealthy and in silence.
Right. So one time I took my daughter to the Marine Corps birthday ball, and the commandant of the Marine Corps at the time was my classmate, but he was a 4-star general and I was a lieutenant colonel, because I left the Marines in 1991, whatever. And so I took my daughter and her husband over to meet the commandant, and we have this great picture of him looking at my medals, or my ribbons, no, my medals, I guess, and you could see he was doing that. He was saying,
ticking the boxes.
How can there be a lieutenant colonel here who has Vietnam ribbons because nobody on active duty has Vietnam ribbons unless you're a 4-star general.
Right.
Today there's none. Okay, today there would be none because we're all in our 70s today. But that was, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. So
Right.
there were still a few of us around who would do that. So anyway, but what
Well, but
we're
he
talking
noticed your
about,
sky dance. I mean, he basically noticed your sky dance. So then that's you. And so then he's not going to do a sky dance for your wife. I mean, in that sense, it's kind of there's something going on there too.
yeah, sure. And so that's all instinctual. So these, anyway, this is the point of instinct and the point of the mystery of life. Okay, so
Right.
at the simplest level, this mystery of life, which is sacred, which is something beyond the civilization. There's nothing civilized about the way osprey live. Okay, here in Annapolis, we have sky wars every day of the summer from March 15th until August. There are sky wars because they're very territorial and other species. So there's a constant attack by the eagles on the osprey, and the eagles are trying to eat the babies, literally. And so you watch this going on, and the eagles and the osprey, the male osprey, are fighting off the eagles all the time. And
well, an osprey are one of the few birds effective at fighting off eagles, because eagles, one of the reasons they can fly so high is they spend so little time looking for food because they're one of the most effective hunters.
right.
So most birds, I mean, they glance away the wrong way, and that baby's plucked out from under them.
Right, and I've literally seen that happen where, on some of these Explorer.com sites, you can actually watch osprey or eagles as they have their babies every summer. And, 1 year we watched, and the osprey left their nest for like a minute, and these 2 eagles came down and took the 2 babies. Boom, they were gone.
Right, and they're flying so high that the
Yeah.
osprey almost don't know they're there, and then
Yeah.
they can just drop down like a falcon. I mean, out of nowhere, they're from 30,000 feet down to the ground. I mean, in a
Right.
way, maybe not that high, but
Right.
high.
Yeah, it's 1,000 feet maybe, but anyway,
Yeah.
if you have your back to where the eagle is,
Right.
and you leave your nest for even a second or a few seconds, you might lose your family. And
Right.
so
There's a metaphor there too for hiding in plain sight and insight. Hiding in plain sight is one thing, but if you stay out of the range of the visual realm of someone else's ability to focus, they don't know you're there.
right.
And so that's
anyway, in the end, in this essay, we're talking about the emergence of an instinctual torrent of anger and wrath, and so the men from the Rust Belt states are resentful, incredibly resentful, because their jobs were taken away and they weren't replaced. And so because that happened, because we exported our manufacturing jobs to China, the men don't have a way to support their family anymore. They thought they had a wonderful income where they could have a middle-class life, and then it simply got taken away for reasons that they could not see, and they were resentful. And so when Donald Trump came along and said, well, we're going to take care of Americans for America type stuff, they naturally were attracted to him. And then when he lost the election and he said the election was stolen. They're naturally angry that their leader, who is supposedly going to help them, he never did really, but supposedly, he convinced them that he was going to help them, but he never did. So they're even more angry, and finally it erupts. And so that's the point about terror, and that's the point about this essay. So,
well, then nature is the magical agent again, except
right.
with the nature is a magical agent from them erupting in terror.
Right.
So,
and so it's exactly like the war between the ospreys and the eagles in a sense, but it's it's sublimated somewhat. But okay, so the opening up of the unconscious always means the outbreak of an intense spiritual suffering. It is as when fertile fields are exposed by the bursting of a dam to a raging torrent. Okay, so that's what we saw on January 6th, that it is a psychic epidemic that we saw. And so going on now, Jung wrote like a prophet when he warned of the continued defilement of the sacred and its consequences in psyche and society. Quote, "No wonder the Western world feels uneasy, for it does not know how much it plays into the hands of the uproarious underworld, and what it has lost through the destruction of numinosities. It has lost its moral and spiritual values to a very dangerous degree. Its moral and spiritual tradition has collapsed and has left a worldwide disorientation and dissociation." And so we see that exactly in the vote in the Senate yesterday, where 43 senators no longer vote based on morality. They vote based on self-interest, on keeping their jobs, and they don't vote based on what's moral, because there's nothing. If you see from a psychological perspective what was going on in the psyche during that time, if you realize that it's a psychic epidemic, then your morality would have to say that you have to vote against the president, because people were killed, property was destroyed, people lost an eye, and so on. And so and so it's pretty terrible. And what's also terrible is they pulled off this charade of giving Officer Goodman the Congressional Gold Medal. But I ask you, what about the doesn't the Capitol Police Force deserve at least a unit citation, because those men were in physical, literal hand-to-hand combat for hours, 4 hours at least. Okay, and so it was kind of like Agincourt or some of the great battles of the Middle Ages, where men were going after each other with maces and swords and spears, and that's exactly what was happening there at the Capitol, because apparently there was some sort of rule of engagement that the Capitol Police Force couldn't use their weapons. So if you can't use your weapon, why even bother wearing it? I guess the idea is to symbolically intimidate your attacker, but if you're not going to use it, now they know that the Capitol Police Force won't use their weapons, and the next time they're going to come at them even harder. And so what we have done now we had a chance to nip this thing in the bud by impeaching Donald Trump and making him ineligible to be in office. And lots of people would be angry about that, but at least civilization could go on. But instead, we allowed this psychic epidemic to sneak through. And so now it's going to spread throughout the United States, and we're going to have a lot more blood as a result of it, unfortunately. And it's an archetypal event, which means when you have an archetype, it's like a phonograph record. If you click that number on the jukebox and the record starts to play, it does not stop until it's finished. And so we saw this in Western Europe during World War II, where it could not be stopped until all the crockery was broken in Western Europe. And millions of people were killed. And finally, we forced Germany to surrender. But it couldn't be stopped until that had happened, until they were on their knees. And so it's funny, my father used to say about the snow in upstate New York, where there's a lot of snow every year. We'd have 6 or 8 meters of snow in a winter. And my father would say, the snow doesn't stop up here until you're on your knees praying, right? until you pray that God will stop it, because we've seen snow in June in upstate New York. So, and I've seen snow in the first week of October up there many times. So, so that's the same sort of thing, archetypal event, that now we've allowed, basically we've allowed Donald Trump to get away with it, and maybe he'll be prosecuted. I don't know, but I'm not sure that a prosecution of Donald Trump would solve this now, because the unruly forces that we saw at the Capitol now see that they've gotten away with this, and the next time they come at us, they're going to come at us with real weapons. Okay, not just spears made out of flagpoles. So,
well, your dad's statement, it makes a kind of leads to Job. Down on your knees praying. This is the mountain that will kill you up above 14,000 feet, and
right.
It takes you beyond your capabilities, and you find you have much more capability than you knew, but you have to. It's beyond comfort zone. It's almost out of life zone.
Right.
And so I like that will bring you to your knees is a similar metaphor there.
Right. So this last sentence of what Jung said here, its moral and spiritual tradition has collapsed and has left a worldwide disorientation and dissociation. So the moral reason to convict Donald Trump obviously collapsed, and okay, we can fight back by unelecting all these immoral senators who gave him a pass, but that's not going to be as powerful and strong as convicting him. So the result is that there's a lot of people with this energy, with this archetypal energy driving them, who will see that as a buy, and we'll see a lot more. Unfortunately, we're going to see a lot more negative things, and one can hope that it won't be like Western Europe with what Hitler did, because Donald Trump was following Hitler's playbook exactly. I mean, he used to keep Mein Kampf on his nightstand, so he memorized Hitler's playbook, and Hitler's playbook is archetypal, and so but what Donald Trump missed is what Jung said, which was the only thing that's going to save the world is the Western democracies. And why?
And one of the things about that strategy is that they never mind if you don't have substance, just lie and then repeat the lie until it is perceived as truth.
Right. And this is precisely what Hitler did. And
Right.
and so the result was he unleashed this archetypal force of energy that swept through. And so the reason that Jung said the only hope he had was the Western democracies, and exactly here's the reason: because in Weimar Germany, all the men were the same. They all thought alike, basically. Okay, they were all brought up alike under the same cultural tradition, and once the archetypal epidemic, the psychic epidemic, starts to wash through them, they all go. Okay, and that's what happened. And so the result of that is they weren't going to stop until they were either dead or they succeeded. And and so,
the myopia of single-mindedness.
Right.
The short-sightedness of single-mindedness.
Right. And so, but what Jung said was the Western democracies, and he meant by that our diversity, because unlike Weimar Germany, where everybody thought alike, in the United States, we have our diversity. So nobody thinks alike. I mean, and the Kingston Trio used to have the merry minuet. Let me see if I can recite it. They're rioting in Africa. They're starving in Spain. There are hurricanes in Florida, and Texas needs rain. The whole world is festering with unhappy souls. The French hate the Germans hate the Poles. The French hate, or the Italians hate Yugoslavs. South Africans hate the Dutch, and I don't like anybody very much. Okay. and that's they called it they called that the merry minuet, but that's really what we're talking about here. So,
well, they ran the wildfire start to finish around the globe. They missed Asia. That's the thing, though. So they, and that generational piece is almost intentional, because they wouldn't think about it.
Right.
That's over there. It's a faraway place at that point.
Right. But now we're all together, and and so in the United States, people outside the United States can't understand our debates on television. They cannot understand why we're always debating, but that's how we diffuse our hatred for one another. Okay, and so that's how those emotions get bled off, is through those debates. And in countries where everybody thinks the same, and you're not allowed to think differently, it takes a hell of a lot to stop it. Okay, and so we saw it happen in the USSR, where even though Stalin murdered 20 million Russians, they just couldn't get themselves out of the communist idea, the idea of everybody being the same, and so everything can be equal. But the problem with that is that you can't, and and what happens is that an oligarchy always forms. So in Russia, what happened was if you had a different idea, they would just kill you. Okay, and so that's another kind of terror, and that's how they were able to maintain power for so long. But in the end, it collapsed. It simply collapsed from its own weight. It wasn't that the United States won the Cold War. It was that the Russian system didn't have enough diversity in it to solve its problems, and so it simply collapsed. I mean, we helped, right? And so,
well, there's subsidence in that formula where, like, just like with soil, because what happens is there comes a point where in the public culture, now the insurgency, now the different ideas are not happening in the open. They haven't disappeared. They were displaced down below. So hence the word the underground. And what happens then is that means there are pockets and cavities, and the weight of the superficial culture that is supplanted on everyone then literally crushes down through those cavities, and then they come back up. So it's the displacement back and forth is pretty consistent.
And so nowadays we say that the Vietnam War was a hot battle in the Cold War, but I never heard that until the 1990s. Okay, so in other words, McNamara and all the people that gave us the Vietnam War, it wasn't in their mind that they were fighting the Russians when we were attacking the Vietnamese. Their story that they were telling until the 1990s was that they were protecting the world from the domino theory, which was that the Chinese would become stronger and stronger in the world by one taking over Southeast Asian countries and then other countries, and we needed to fight back. So their story was we were fighting against China taking over the world by the domino theory, one by one, and nobody ever mentioned Russia. I never heard that. Okay, and I was in the middle of the Vietnam War myself, and so for me it was a war, and it was a war against the domino theory. Okay, and it was only in the 1990s, which was a good 15, 20 years after the Vietnam War was over, that people started to talk about it being a hot battle in the Cold War. And so, yes, okay, fair enough. I can look back at it now from a historical perspective, and I can see that the buildup of the American military at that time scared the Russians to death. So they spent a lot of money on arms and so on. And that ultimately caused their economy to collapse. Fair enough. Okay. So in that sense, it was a hot battle in the Cold War. But, back in 1960, you wouldn't have done that. Okay. You wouldn't have started a war with a bunch of North Vietnamese sitting in Hanoi so that you could run the Russians out of money. that was not the reason, the excuse for doing the war. It wasn't any such thing. It's just that was the way it worked. Yes, that's the way it worked with 2020 hindsight. But at the time, that isn't what the powers that be were doing. Okay, what the powers that be were doing was, their excuse was to defend the world from the domino theory, and what they were doing was building up the military-industrial complex, which which Eisenhower had warned us about in his last speech. So if you go listen to the last speech of Dwight Eisenhower before he left office, that's exactly what he was warning against, and that's what they did. And you know, it's my father took me down on the dock of Yokosuka, which is the headquarters of the 7th Fleet, in 1962, and showed me this line of gray hulls going out of Tokyo Bay. And he says, "See that, Skip?" And I said, "Yeah, Dad." He says, "That's the Marines. They're going to Vietnam." And 1962, mind you. Okay. And I said, "Why, Dad?" And he said, "Everybody in the military has either been to Vietnam, is there now, or is going there." Okay. That one sentence is so important. So here's a commander, an active commander in the U.S. Navy in 1962. So 3 years before we officially entered the Vietnam War. And he knew enough to say to his 15-year-old son, everybody in the military has either been to Vietnam, is there now, or is going there. Okay, so he already knew it at that time. And I said, "Why, Dad?" And he said, "Because the generals need a war in order to advance their careers." Okay, but it was
to make
also
rank.
Yeah, and also because the military-industrial complex needed a war in order to build up the military, you know, the war-fighting industry. And, you know, and so we have that to this day. And now the war has gone to hyperspace. So, you know, most people don't notice, but, you know, the defense budget in the United States was about $350 billion at the end of the 1990s. And so I thought, and a lot of people thought, that we already were spending too much money on the military at that point. But now the military budget is over $700 billion or $650 billion. So it's double. So what are they spending all the money on? Well, it's not Marine Corps divisions. Okay, we've increased the Marine Corps by 25,000 men in that time. And 25,000 Marines costs about, I think it's $10 billion over 10 years. Okay. If you hire a division of Marines, it costs about $10 billion over 10 years. And if you build an aircraft carrier, it costs about $10 billion to build an aircraft carrier. And it costs about $10 billion to put an air wing on the aircraft carrier. So that's 20 billion. So now you've got an aircraft carrier and a Marine division, that's 30 billion. So what are they spending the other 300 billion on? Okay, that's the question. And, you know, apparently the answer to that is by cybersecurity. But I don't know the answer. I'm just guessing. And so,
Well, you know, an anecdotal example here, which I've always found a little quirky and of semi-interest, is even the board game Risk has this little island in the place of Japan called Kamchatka.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that's where you get backed into a corner and then you lose. I mean, that's how it works. But the word Kamchatka is more of a Ruski-Russian, Armenia and Kazakhstan, kind of that area of kind of name than it is Asian. And so even in that board, I don't know the date that game started, but even then there was kind of those from the north will come down kind of concept, even in the naming on the board game. They're almost prescient. Right.
And that was, I remember that movie or that board game coming out in the 70s. And as a military officer at the time, I thought it was a great board game. I loved it. But in point of fact, we can't love it. We have to be smarter than that.
Right.
And you know, people, even today, we worry about China, right? Or a lot of people worry about China. And so, so I have a person that I sponsored at the Naval Academy who became a F-18 pilot. And he calls me up one day and he said, well, Skip, you know, China is such a big threat. And he says they can destroy the Navy in the Formosa Strait. Okay, so the U.S. has always, in effect, stood as a defender of Taiwan. Okay, even though Taiwan's officially part of China now, but at the time, he, as an active duty naval officer, was worried about the fact that his aircraft carrier could be put in the Formosa Strait, and you know, the most airplanes that would be on that aircraft carrier would be 100. And so if we put 5 aircraft carriers out there, that would be 500. And he said the Chinese can put 3,000 fighter jets up against them, and they would be heavily outnumbered. And so I said, well, don't worry about that, because if they did that, China would collapse. And he says, why? And he says, because, or I said to him, because the US owes the Chinese, like, at this point, it's probably $3 trillion. Okay, the Chinese have lent the United States like $3 trillion. And so that's in the form of little green electrons. And so if there was ever a war between China and the United States, China would collapse, because it's our industry, which we did export to China, which supports the Chinese government. Okay. And if we were in a war with China, I don't think we'd be importing much from China. And the result,
Well, and they'd stop payment in any
form.
form.
and we wouldn't pay the $3 trillion either. We just, you know, we would become a deadbeat on that Chinese debt. And because after all, it's only little green electrons. And so
well, and the turn side applies too, that we would not attack them that way, because we need their industry.
That's right.
I mean, we're both in bed with each other. I mean,
that's right. That hugely. And so, you know, at the time I was on active duty in the Marine Corps and sent to language school for Mandarin Chinese, you know, it looked like we could be in a war with China. But in 1972, when Nixon opened up China to the West with Henry Kissinger, they, in effect, at that time, agreed to export our industry to China.
right.
And that has been a wonderful thing for the Chinese people. And it's been a wonderful thing for Walmart. And it's been a wonderful thing for the American people, because we get a lot of goods that would cost us way more if we weren't manufacturing them in China. And so the point is that the Chinese economy would collapse if there was a war between the U.S. and China. So it's unthinkable that we could do that. We would do that. And so
the leverage points are that they could raise. We have the military, but all they have to do as a military gesture is raise the prices. You know,
sure.
And there's a strategy. It's just simple. And so that it's not a mirrored symmetry. We have something they don't, and they have something we don't, and they both work together as one thing.
Right. And one of the big points is we don't make shoes anymore. So
Where's the military going to get boots? Yeah.
Yeah, we can't make combat boots without China.
Right.
And so,
and it sounds so counterintuitive, but it's unfortunately it's dead on true.
Right. And so the point is that the world itself is becoming, humanity is becoming one world. Yeah. And we have to have a perception of that so that we can control our instincts, because our instincts are very combative. And so my young man who's an F-18 pilot, you know, he's trained to be a military officer and fly an airplane, right? But we can never use that. Okay, we can never use that, because if we do, I mean, we can use it in little dust-ups around the world, but we cannot use it in a big dust-up because, you know, it just, humanity would collapse if we did that. And so, so a young man who's trained to fly an airplane, he doesn't know that because he hasn't been around long enough. But the realities are such that that's the case. And so what the people on January the 6th are resentful about, you know, they have every right to be resentful. I'm resentful also because, you know, I lost my life savings to the profligacy of the financial industry. And people in government haven't taken care of average people like you and me. So we're rightfully resentful. I mean, I don't think there's anybody in my generation, the baby boom generation, that didn't lose tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars from the crash of 2008, which was simply caused by Wall Street mortgage banks running a big party and having the punch bowl out and letting everybody run up the risk. You know, they added risk until it suddenly finally collapsed, and that's inexcusable. And so.
And there's an example of that displacement again, too, to the underworld, to this. Nothing was lost, money, but the physical properties just went into the shadow market.
Right.
I mean, for again, the control of, let's just raise the price.
Right. Okay. So anyway, the point is that this disorientation and this lack of morality, we have a problem with it. And we have to understand it so that we can go back and resolve some of these issues. So let's read on with Tacey here. So let me just reread the last sentence of Jung's quote. Its moral and spiritual tradition has collapsed and has left a worldwide disorientation and dissociation. So yes, those people that attacked the Capitol on June 6th are, you know, they just don't know how to get their lifestyle back. And I can't tell them how to do it. But I can tell you that when we exported their jobs to China, we really should have focused on creating other jobs for them in some way, which we didn't. We just left them hanging. And so, you know, they're naturally disoriented and dissociated. They don't know what to do.
You know, your Osprey Eagle example actually just became even more poignant to me, because in that whole group, there's a lot of conflict, a lot of combative, a lot of chest beating, a lot of pecking order pushing, which is interesting. But they're the Ospreys, very territorial, defending themselves, fighting naturally against the Eagles, so to speak, those who come from the higher place. And so I think that example fits the resentment there, because in one sense they're protecting themselves because they're lashing out, fighting because they're uncomfortable, and all this trauma is erupting.
Right. Okay, so reading on now. This is what the Hebrew prophets said. If the sacred is not nurtured, the uproarious underworld will erupt, contaminating the world with the wrong kind of spirits, leading to a perilous situation. Our times have demonstrated what it means when the gates of the psychic underworld are thrown open. Jung said that nurturing the sacred has a therapeutic effect and acts as a bulwark against the destructive forces of the unconscious. Elsewhere, he personifies the numinous as a wrathful power. Quote, seeking revenge for the violence his reason has done to her, seeking revenge for the violence his reason has done to her. Outraged nature only awaits the moment when the partition falls so as to overwhelm the conscious life with destruction. Man has been aware of this danger to the psyche since the earliest times, even in the most primitive stages of culture. It was to arm himself against this threat and to heal the damage done that he developed religious and magical practices. This is why the medicine man is also the priest. He is the savior of the soul as well as of the body. And religions are systems of healing for psychic illness. And so the point is that religions have always served to, soothe the savage beast, if you will. And so,
like a psychotherapeutic event.
Right. So when the religions no longer soothe sufficiently, which is the case with the Proud Boys and so on, then the psychic event is going to erupt, which it did, and we're paying the price for it. And we're still going to be paying the price for it because
right.
we didn't scotch it yesterday. So the result is that's
2 3/4 to 3.5 generations. I mean, for that, and right. That's if it's on the downward spiral. It may amplify before, and that could intensify.
We can hope that Americans will wake up now and see that we've lost this moral structure and that we have to do something about that. And that means that government has to take a responsibility to compensate for the losses. If we don't do that, then we're going to have a very, very dark time.
Well, and I on Facebook decided during the whole election, I decided no politics, and I'm not going to unfriend all the people who I think are now evil. They're not all the people who I agree with, and I left them. And I left them because they were friends, but also because of thumb on the pulse. And now, as yesterday, the factions, there was still such an intellectual us and them of the people who said this was a win, and then people, this is an outrage. And so it has not ebbed. It's
no, it hasn't ebbed at all. And
no, at all.
Unless so, the GOP has taken up this idea that the Democrats are about socialism, but that's, socialism is, 100 years ago. That isn't now.
Right.
What we need now is, and what should have been done 40 or 50 years ago, is when we sent heavy industry to China and took all those people's livelihood away and their self-respect away, we had to give them something else. And so one of the things we could have given them is infrastructure jobs, like building highways. Mm-hmm. But instead, the GOP decided to say no, be the party of no, and not replace our bridges and not repair our highways. So,
well, and even when they earmark and call it democratic socialism, this is like a Lilith scenario. They're using those two words to demonize and weaponize the word equality, so they can further get away, because no one's going to equate democratic socialism with equality. Even if you understand it, it's still kind of a bad overlap.
Right.
But so they're demonizing good things.
Right. And so what needs to be done is we need to solve the resentment, which is justified. I acknowledge it's justified because, if you take my job away and make it so I can't support my family, I'm naturally angry.
Well, my grandfather used to say, you've got to take out the trash before you can remove the stink. I mean, it's right. It's simple.
And so it's not, what we need to do is build more razor wire around our capital. What we need to do is start spending some money on infrastructure and giving those people that have resentment some work so that they have self-respect and can support their families. Then we can solve this problem. But as long as
if you look at the razor wire, that gesture takes us back to a medieval fortified town.
Yeah.
I mean, it's abstract, it's transparent walls, but they will cut the holy heck out of you. So people, they create a barrier, and that's a fortified city. I mean, and that's a feudal era solution. It was smart to do it, just to, because people have to mean it to get through that.
Right.
But it's not a modern gesture. It's a very feudal action.
Right. Okay, so religions were developed to propitiate the powers that early humanity sensed could overwhelm life and cause destruction. Although Christianity had refined its understanding of the sacred to emphasize its good and gentle aspects, the Jews had a different understanding of the divine. The ferocity was part of its character. Christianity believes that its revelation superseded the Jewish story, but it may be that it lost something integral when it rejected the God image of the Old Testament. In Exodus, Yahweh says to the Jews, I will send my terror before you and will throw into confusion all the people. In Proverbs, Psalms, and the prophetic writings, we see an emphasis on divine wrath, which shocks Christians because they lost touch with this aspect of the numinous. So the point is, as Dr. Jung says in his letter to David Cox, which you can find in my reading of the new God image on the home page of this YouTube channel. When you say God, it has an equivalency of the unconscious. And we can certainly see this because the dark side of God has now erupted in the capital of our country. And that is, God is the collective unconscious. God is also the God image within us. So our unconscious is that force that causes us to do things. So it's myself that causes me to turn on Zoom at 8:00 on Sunday morning and start talking. That's myself telling me, Skip, you have to do this because you're the one that understands it. And you have the experience. So that's myself forcing me to do it. And it's done that for 10 years, first as with the Archetype and Action website, and then since 2016 with the YouTube channel. And I've had no choice about it. I've had to do it because if I denied that, then myself would just whip up on me.
Well, there's the capital M must there.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Not so much, there's the calling, but then the verb of it is the must. And then you must do. I mean, when you find those things you must do, it doesn't matter sick or healthy or, border feel like it's a hassle. It's not even discipline anymore. This is like breath in a way.
Right. And so the the point about Jung and why he's unique is this house that he built behind me. Okay, that's his confession of faith in stone, because he built this house to put himself in the sense of a human being of the 16th century. So this house has no electricity in it. It has no plumbing in it. And he said, if somebody from the 16th century came here, the only thing that he would find that wasn't of the 16th century is the matches. Okay. Now, why? Because he wanted to go to this place and live in it and start to feel his unconscious as the way a 16th century man would. Okay. And that's what he did. And so he built this house. He was forced to build it in 4 stages, and each stage was separated by 4 years. So he started with this part right here behind me, and which you can see over my right shoulder, but it looks like my left shoulder on the screen, I think. So he started there and he built that. And then 4 years later, his self told him to build another part and another part and another part. So it ultimately had 4 sections. And then when he got his stone delivered, what happened was the masons who were working with him on this house had stones delivered from a quarry across the lake, and they realized that this particular stone didn't match any of their specifications for building the house, and they were going to send it back. The masons were going to send it back, but Jung saw it and immediately knew that that was his stone, that he needed that. And so he said to the masons, and his self told him that, that's my stone, I need it, leave it there. And so
well, there's also, he had changed in 4 years, so the matching was not important. Matching would have actually been makeup, superficial and unnatural. And he was there, basically he was being an osprey, and he's making a house for his womb of his work for him to live in.
Right. And so that stone, he didn't have any plan for that stone. He simply chiseled into it when he was 75 years old. So when he was my age, a little over my age, he said, that's my stone, I have to work on it. And then his psyche told him what to chisel into it. And so now the meaning of that stone, of the Bollingen stone, is profound. And it was told to him by his psyche. And
the pictures of him doing that with the steampunk glasses, the goggles, I mean, and you just see his forearms. I mean, it's like this is a person who, he got his hands dirty. I mean,
he was really into it. So
do you have that picture?
Yeah, I'm going to get it here just a minute.
Yeah, because that picture of Jung as the badass, outside of the work.
No, he was definitely a badass. Let's see.
Just that him holding the spike, and I mean, it's just the whole. There's so much captured, so much embraced in that one still image.
Okay, here it is. I ought to have this on my desktop, I guess. That would be the sensible place to put it.
Well, there's so many. I mean,
yeah, but this is the front of the Bollingen stone. And so now it appears to be very sensible and obvious that this is what he would put there, but and it's written in Greek and Latin, so you have to go study what he was saying. But he's got the sun here and the moon, and
Venus and Jupiter and Saturn and Mars,
all these symbols of things that he was working with throughout his life. And even the symbol in the center of the homunculus is meaningful, but you have to study Jungian psychology in order to appreciate its meaning. But in any case, it is very meaningful to us now. But it wasn't until his age 75 that his self was telling him that's what he had to do. And so my self has been telling me for years that this is what I have to do. So my confession of faith is not in stone, it's in videos on this YouTube channel. And so,
Skip, can I share my screen? I have the picture of him actually doing that.
Yeah, here, just a minute. Let me do that. All right, so there you go. Go ahead, share your screen.
Get this in here.
Right, and Yuan says Jung likes both astrology and shamanism. And so here he is
with his pipe and this glass, these goggles.
He looks like a steampunk guy.
Well, it's like, is this the birth of the Hells Angels? I mean, look at the power. And then funny with the pipe, like Gunnar said, the pipe and then these safety goggles. I mean, he's not messing around.
Yeah.
And his fancy watch at the same time.
Yeah, that's a classic Jung picture. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when I saw that the first time, I went, I've always liked him, but now I think I like him even more. I mean, it's
right. Yeah. So anyway, his point here is that Christianity just said, oh, let's just make nice with everyone, right? And the problem is that we haven't understood that God has two sides, has a light side and a dark side. We all have this dark side. And, who hasn't had a fantasy of attacking or killing somebody someday? I mean, even women have that. And so that's the dark side. And we either manage that properly through morality and other methods, or it runs amok. Okay, which is what.
Well, and I, for one, steeped in the martial arts for a couple of decades, so that fighting is a little overrated. But the most simple quote I ever heard, and it's a joke at the same time, but is the Confucius say, "Man who have mosquito land on testicles, learn quickly violence, not the best first course of action."
Okay.
So I mean, it kind of cuts through the crap, but at the same time, it's funny.
Okay,
anyway.
So moving on from that wonderful illusion, I want to go back to Anderson Cooper and the situation in France. So Anderson Cooper was in Paris trying to understand what was causing the young Muslim men to go to Iraq to fight for ISIS. And so he asked the two Muslim men, well, these men have no way of proving their manhood. So if France had provided work for these young Muslim men, then where they could, prove their manhood by creating a living wage and a sense of self-respect by building something, then they wouldn't have gone to Iraq. That's the idea.
Right.
That's the point. And so we have that same situation in the United States, which is not socialism. I mean, we have 165,000 bridges that are collapsing in the United States because we have not taken care of our infrastructure since 1950.
Mm-hmm.
And or since the 50s when we built the interstate highway system. But since that time, we haven't properly maintained our infrastructure, which is also reflected in the fact that we haven't properly maintained our psychic life. And so the men who attacked the Capitol on January 6th really didn't know why they were there. Okay, they got there and they were totally inarticulate. They couldn't speak about it because something erupted within them, and they couldn't say what it was that was forcing them to do that. Okay, they just were, the reporters were asking them about it, and they just couldn't articulate it. And the essence of it is what Jung and Edinger say, which is that terrorism is caused by resentment. The resentment is natural, but because our savings and our livelihoods have been taken away from us, it's true of me and millions of other American men. And so it's not socialism to build our highways. It's what we need to do to replace the jobs that we sent to China. And by the same token, we can't take those jobs away from China, because if we just say, okay, well, we're going to move our manufacturing back to the U.S. and not leave it in China so that men can have $30 an hour jobs building automobiles again. And we can't do that, because if we do that, then Chinese men would lose their self-respect. And at the same time, we would be upset because our automobiles would cost twice as much, and we would be resentful about that. And so it's absolutely necessary for the human species to develop, to evolve, to recognize that these forces are in the unconscious, and we have to address them. We can't just create a society of men who have nothing to do and who have no way of proving themselves as men, of building the nest for the female in the osprey sense. If we keep doing that, we're going to have eruptions left, right, and center. We absolutely must replace those jobs that were sent to China.
Well,
not in the same way.
Not in the same way. And honestly, the infrastructure, I'll give you a direct example of why it's not socialism. I mean, if you look at the American Association of Highway Safety Transportation Officials, I mean, I was involved with that for I don't know how long. If you look at the design of highways, highway structure and design, the architecture requires every so often to have a 1 mile perfectly flat, perfectly straight segment, so that there are basically implied runways all over the country where we could refuel if necessary within our bounds. So it's a military strategic design as to intermittently how the highways are even laid out.
Well, and I want to get to Yuan's point here, but as a tank officer, I can tell you, because I served for 8 years in the 8th Tank Battalion of the Marine Corps. As a tank officer, I can tell you that the interstate highway system was built to the specifications of tank warfare. So the whole point is that you can drive the tanks down those highways and get anywhere in the country within a day or two. And Eisenhower did that explicitly because in 1935, he and George Patton, who was the tank commander of World War II, but 10 years earlier, he and George Patton had been assigned to lead a convoy across the United States, which included many trucks and tanks and all kinds of equipment. And they were, I forget where they were going from to, but I think they were going to basically to San Francisco or Northern California from the east, from Pennsylvania or someplace. And it took them 55 days to go from the East Coast to the West Coast with all this equipment. And so from his perspective, he wanted to make it so that we in the United States, if we had to defend ourselves, could move our heavy equipment across the United States, not only with airfields, but with also the highways would be able to handle tanks. And so in my reserve unit, we had a tank company in Syracuse, New York, and every summer we would drive the tanks up to what is now called Fort Drum, but was Camp Drum at the time. It used to be a National Guard base. Now it's the headquarters of the 10th Mountain Division now, but and we keep that base because it allows us to train for winter warfare, okay, among other things, but mainly for that, because up in Watertown, New York, there's lots of snow all the time. So that's why the 10th Mountain Division is now headquartered there. But back in my day, when it was still a National Guard base, it was a training area for the reserve, the American Reserve, both Guard and Reserve. So it was a training base for my Marine Corps Reserve unit. And we had tanks in Syracuse, and we literally drove our tanks up that highway to Fort Drum every summer. And so people are going on their vacation to the Thousand Islands, and they're driving around along the highway, and all of a sudden, oh my God, I'm driving past a tank. And they would say, "Oh, look at that! Look at that!"
It's interesting because you'd think you'd know what you'd feel like, but in Colorado too, between Colorado Springs, every once in a while there's something going on where they just have to move this from here to here. And I'm used to in Texas, having tractors, but there's something about a tank on the road that it's just not like nothing else.
Right. Okay. So Eisenhower built the interstate highway system, but the problem is, in our infinite wisdom, we haven't maintained it and properly. And so if we understand that what we have to do is compensate, that if we're going to send our industry to China, then we have to provide something else for these men to do. Otherwise, they're sitting idle, and they have all kinds of poison ideas going on in their psyche because of their resentment. That's not good either. So the immorality of the GOP was simply on display yesterday, and they're trying to protect their own jobs without understanding that they have to, they have a responsibility to protect us. That's their job. And the way they have to do it is to understand that psychologically we need a few things in order to have self-respect. And if we don't provide those things in some way in the country, it's going to come back and bite us, which is what it did on January the 6th. And we were very lucky that we didn't have a much worse situation, but we will have a much worse situation unless that gets fixed.
And nurturing the sacred. I mean, if the sacred is not nurtured, then evil's violence will rise up and erupt. That it's each of our job to nurture the sacred. And I think now the government's job for healing, it doesn't sound very governmental, but to nurture the sacred.
Right. And so we have to provide the opportunity to solve that problem.
Right.
And it's a problem that can't be solved by individuals. It needs to be solved by the government. And so, as Jung correctly says, the suffering of human beings in the lower level of society are the same everywhere. So, it goes
Good
back
point.
to this very fundamental idea of, a male has to build a home for his wife, and then he has to give her security. He has to get her attention, of course, but he has to give her a secure place, because a human woman is vulnerable for the 20 years that it takes to raise a human child. And if the male can't do that, then they don't have self-respect, and they have to figure out, how do I get self-respect if I can't support my family, which is, all the way back to the instinctual level, which, as I've shown in this discussion, goes back way beyond a couple 100 million years ago. It goes back to every species on the planet. And
also in regards to building the house, there is the put your own house in order part in mind, and the capital S self of first you build your house of yourself, and then you can build one for another. And what does it get when prosperity strikes? Don't build a bigger house, get a longer table.
Right. So reading on here, let me see where I can get to in this. Okay, let me try to do this. So next paragraph. Centuries before Christianity, the Greeks had a stark comprehension of the destructive face of the divine. This aspect showed itself when people turned away from the sacred and saw themselves as no longer obligated to express reverence to the mysteries of life. This condition, which the Greeks called hubris, pridefulness, which the Greeks called hubris, was severely punished by the gods. Greek drama and literature are replete with the terrifying wrath that the Olympian gods delivered to those who had spurned them. Perhaps it is time to reclaim these ancient heritages, Hebraism and Hellenism, which shaped Western culture. While important not to lose sight of the sacred as the source of illumination, which is the hope of Christianity, in a darkly turbulent time in which the sacred is returning after exile, we have to adjust ourselves to the paradoxical nature of divine reality. Okay, reading on. There is, however, an alternative way to view this, which does not hinge on speculations about the nature of the divine. Perhaps it is not so much that God becomes evil, but that the inward figure within our being, the soul, becomes malign when we fail to connect with the divine, when we fail to connect with this sacred mystery of life. The soul is the third thing between humanity and divinity, and its job is to facilitate the connection between heaven and earth. when we neglect to attend to this relation, the soul, as the organ of mediation, turns away and opposes our resistance. From where we stand, it looks as if God had taken up arms against us, but it is our soul that stares us down with wrath and terror. Okay, so it's our soul, or the soullessness of the GOP, that turned its back on the morality of the country and on all the people that are resentful for, we lost our life savings in 2008 due to the fact that the GOP gave a bye to the mortgage bankers to behave badly. And government has turned its back on these resentful people because we took their jobs away by allowing them to be exported to China, which was a good idea 40 years ago, because it made us so we didn't feel we had to fight a war with China. But the bad thing is we didn't understand that we also had to replace those jobs in some way, and we didn't do that. Okay, so the soul stands in for the divine in this situation, and perhaps we make a mistake if we assume that this fearsome aspect of the divine itself, we ought not assume that we can behold the face of the holy other or ascribe to it attributes that arise from the intermediary. The true nature of God remains an unfathomable mystery. Okay, so it's a mystery how you could move so many Americans carrying American flags and claiming patriotism, how you could move them to attack the Capitol, but nonetheless you could. The soul, says Rilke, is like a towering angel that stands over against us and yet offers transformation if we surrender to it. The soul is the beginning of terror, which we are barely able to endure, and we are awed because it serenely disdains to annihilate us. Every angel is terrible, and so I hold myself back and swallow the cry of a darkened sobbing. That was Rilke poem. That, I suspect, is what most of us do. We retreat from the darkness of the soul, swallow our anguish, and refuse engagement. In another poem, Rilke writes that whoever is beaten by the angel emerges strengthened. Winning is not what we should seek, but being defeated decisively by constantly greater beings is how we develop as spiritual beings. In the same years that Jung began his Red Book, an epic on the soul's eruption in modern times, Rilke was writing poetry on the annihilating and transforming forces that eclipse the ego. Okay, I'll stop there for the moment. And of course, the Red Book begins with Jung talking about the spirit of the depths. And so so I'm looking at the Red Book itself now, and on page 119 of the Reader's Edition, 119 of the Reader's Edition, here's what he says. If I speak in the spirit of this time, I must say, no one and nothing can justify what I must proclaim to you. Justification is superfluous to me, since I have no choice, but I must. I have learned that in addition to the spirit of this time, there is still another spirit at work, namely that which rules the depths of everything contemporary. The spirit of this time would like to hear use and value. I also thought this way, and my humanity still thinks this way, but that other spirit forces me nevertheless to speak beyond justification use, and meaning. Filled with human pride and blinded by the presumptuous spirit of the times. Remember hubris from the Greeks. I long sought to hold that other spirit away from me, but I did not consider that the spirit of the depths from time immemorial and for all the future possesses a greater power than the spirit of this time, who changes with the generations. The spirit of the depths has subjected all my pride and arrogance to the power of judgment. He took away my belief in science. He robbed me of the joy of explaining and ordering things. And he let devotion to the ideals of this time die out in me. He forced me down to the last and simplest things. The spirit of the depths took my understanding and all my knowledge and placed them at the service of the inexplicable and the paradoxical. He robbed me of speech and writing for everything that was not in his service, namely the melting together of sense and nonsense that produces the supreme meaning. And then he says the following in
That's so very Job, too.
right. So let me read the rest of this, because this is his definition of the supreme meaning, which is in italics on page 120 of the Reader's Edition. He says, but the supreme meaning is the path, the way, and the bridge to what is to come. That is the God yet to come. It is not the coming God himself, but his image which appears in the supreme meaning. God is an image, and those who worship him must worship him in the image of the supreme meaning. The supreme meaning is not a meaning and not an absurdity. It is an image and force in one, magnificence and force together. So remember from Star Wars, let the force be with you, right? So God is an image and force in one, magnificence and force together. The supreme meaning is the beginning and the end. It is the bridge of going across and fulfillment. Other gods died of their temporality, yet the supreme meaning never dies. It turns into meaning and then into absurdity. And out of the fire and blood of their collision, the supreme meaning rises up, rejuvenated anew. The image of God has a shadow. The supreme meaning is real and casts a shadow for what can be actual and corporeal and have no shadow. The shadow is nonsense. It lacks force and has no continued existence through itself. But nonsense is the inseparable and undying brother of the supreme meaning. Like plants, so men also grow, some in the light, others in the shadows. There are many who need the shadows and not the light. The image of God throws a shadow that is just as great as itself. The supreme meaning is great and small. It is as wide as the space of the starry heaven and as narrow as the cell of the living God. The spirit of this time in me wanted to recognize the greatness and extent of the supreme meaning, but not its littleness. The spirit of the depths, however, conquered this arrogance, and I had to swallow the small as a means of healing the immortal in me. It completely burnt up my innards, since it was the inglorious and unheroic. It was even ridiculous and revolting, but the pliers of the spirit of the depths held me, and I had to drink the bitterest of all draughts. And well, I'll finish this bit here. The spirit of this time tempted me with the thought that all this belongs to the shadowiness of the God image. This would be pernicious deception, since the shadow is nonsense. But the small, narrow, and banal is not nonsense, but one of both of the essences of the Godhead. I resisted recognizing that the everyday belongs to the image of the Godhead. I fled this thought. I hid myself behind the highest and the coldest stars. And so the spirit of this time whispered to me this supreme meaning, this image of God, this melting together of the hot and the cold, that is you and only you. But the spirit of the depths spoke to me. You are an image of the unending world. All the last mysteries of becoming and passing away live in you. If you did not possess all this, how could you know? Okay, so see a perfect example of this in the attack on the Capitol, which is that those mostly men too are loyal Americans, and they are our brothers, and we need to understand the message of what it is that they brought to us there. And so, you know, it very simply, I've talked about it at length in this discussion, which is, it very simply is that those men, people, including women, have resentment, and it's a justified resentment for what has happened to them. And we need to address that resentment in order to perfect our union and perfect our country. And until we do, until we accept that and make a change, we're going to see more of this, and much bloodier, as Jung pointed out. He was looking at World War I and what was there at the time that he was writing this, but we have the same things today. And so if we don't give the American people, especially men, the ability to gain self-respect by being able to support their families, then that resentment is going to boil over again and again, and in much bloodier ways than it did on January 6th. And that has nothing to do with socialism. It has to do with understanding the human species and the fact that we're all like we men are all like the osprey male. We need to be able to have self-respect, and we need to be able to build a reliable home for the women, and to support them so that they can do the necessary work of women, which is to raise the next generation. And this isn't to mean that women should go back home and not be a part of ongoing life, because you're only raising children for, let's say, 20 to 30 years, and we're living 100 years now. So women are half of us, the feminine is half of us, and women can also make tremendous contributions to humanity, and are doing. I get the monthly newsletter from the U.S. Naval Academy, and this week the latest edition came out, and the Navy has just assigned a woman as the first female captain of an aircraft carrier. And the Navy or NASA has just selected 2 Naval Academy graduates, both women, one a Navy lieutenant commander and one a Marine lieutenant colonel, to be in the NASA cadre that will land on the moon in 2024. And so
also the Air Force over the Super Bowl, wasn't that woman pilot the first woman stealth bomber fighter pilot?
Yeah, maybe.
And
Yeah,
fewer
what-
people have been fighter pilots on stealth bombers than have been to the moon, is my understanding.
Well,
Is that not true?
no, that's not true, because we have many stealth bombers today, and there have only been 12 that
12,
have gone to the
yeah.
moon. So
Okay.
so
That must have
the
been an
fact
old
is
stat.
that women are what holds society together. Actually, women rebuild civilization when men go out and destroy it, and that has been true historically. And
That's why the
so,
Amazons got rid of most of us.
yeah, maybe. And so we need
They wouldn't take it.
we certainly need to have better respect for women. We men have to have more respect for women, and there's no question that this woman who's becoming the captain of an aircraft carrier deserves respect. She has 3,000 hours of flying in a naval aircraft, and so that means landing on aircraft carriers, thousands of times. Okay, 3,000 hours in a Navy airplane means that you've landed on a aircraft carrier probably 12 or 1,300 times in your career. And so she certainly has the experiences and knows what it takes to be the leader of an aircraft carrier. So,
And also the self-respect of the feminine within the male. Like
absolutely,
me self-respecting my sacred feminine.
yeah,
My Eros.
right,
Rather than leading with my logos.
yeah, and as the big cat says, Obama was pragmatic. He was restrained by a very narrow majority in Congress. He stabilized the economy and the deficits. It was a relatively smooth 8 years, which, there's no doubt in my mind that when Obama was president was actually the best 8 years of any administration that I've seen in my lifetime.
And I would agree. And the key word from your last passage to me applies to that. Banal, boring, commonplace, everyday, the banal, BANAL. And
Right.
that banal has no us and them. It has the everyday things that we all do. We all eat, we all sleep, etc. And that's where it's at. That's where the common ground, that's where the same table is in the everyday things that we all do, not in the elegance and exquisite opinions that we can color our lives with. So if we get rid of our own osprey feathers and get down to we're osprey, protect ourselves from the eagles, so to speak. Right. And the eagles are usually within us more than they are at us.
Oh, definitely. And so what we Americans need to keep in mind is that the Americans who attacked the Capitol are not our enemy. Okay?
Right.
The Proud Boys are not our enemy. They are also Americans and thoughtful Americans too. They just think that the only way to keep America is violently. And what we have to prove and demonstrate is that we have to understand what's causing them to want to be the way they are, and that what that cause is fundamental resentment. And so we can look right back to this very fundamental instinctual aspect of men need self-respect, and they need to be able to support their families. And that's that's fundamental in all species and has been for hundreds of millions of years. And it gets more complex in the human species, but when it comes right down to it, that's what it's about. And so unless we can unless we can give those men, especially in the Rust Belt, self-respect and a way to support their families, then we're going to have continued resentment. And so,
Well, and you get the whole idle hands. Nothing worse than idle hands. I mean, because you
Yeah.
sit around bored and you come up with trouble instead of, if you're working, you come up with sacred things.
yeah. And what is it? Idle mind is the devil's playground. Well, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's where it comes from. Yeah.
Right.
So beware the idle hands. An idle
Right.
mind is the devil's playground.
Okay, so we've addressed another major part of this essay. We have, let's see how much we have to go here. We have quite a bit to do yet in this essay, so we probably have 2 or 3 more weeks of this, but as you can see, it's quite opposite. It's right on where we need to be.
Yeah, apropos, very much.
And
very current.
So, so I'll just remind the quote from Jung, but the spirit of the depths wants the struggle to be understood as a conflict in every man's own nature. Okay, so this is within all of us, and we all have to reflect very seriously on where we are and what we need. And, if we don't have a party that is going to allow us to rebuild the infrastructure of the country, then we need to get new politicians who will. And it's not socialist, it's common sense psychology that we have to recognize.
Well, the Mark Twain quote, politicians and diapers should both be changed often and for the same reasons.
Yeah, very much so. So, Gunnar, you've been very quiet during this session. Did you have anything you wanted to comment on from outside the U.S.? And Yuan can too if she wants, but I suspect she wants to remain silent here. But you can certainly speak.
I was wondering if you're familiar with the Russian-American writer Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand, yes, of course we are. She's been jammed down our throat the last 10 years.
The fountain headache.
Yeah. I noticed there's a lot of commonality between rich and powerful people. They all seem to worship her. And I remember there was a journalist who once asked her if she was frightened of death. And she replied, "I'm not frightened of death. I won't die," she said. And the journalist asked her, "What do you mean?" And she replied, "I won't die. The world will die." What it meant that if you're an individualistic, narcissistic person, then the world is inside your head and there's nothing else. And she is correct because she is the center of the world. And it seems that it seems like the politics doesn't have the vision of the future, because we live in a world of individual where everyone is encouraged to believe in what they feel, and what they want is the center of the world.
Yeah, I mean, she definitely was a narcissist, and we have to understand that that's the way we are, and we have to be a little bit forgiving of our fellow man for not being as far along in psychological development as Carl Jung was. And what is evident is that Carl Jung not only won't die, but can't die because and he knew that, because his spirit lives on and is in this conversation today. And I actually had a little debate with my Indian colleague, who said, well, you don't die until the last person who knows your name dies, and then you die. But actually, that's not true. Okay, the truth is that we don't die. We are all, we're in effect players of energy. Okay, we're kind of Walkman of energy. And so we gather energy together and we express it out in a certain way, which obviously I am and Jordan is during this conversation. And so that energy then goes out into the universe, and it makes not one whit of difference whether people remember our names or not, because the energy that we express out will continue long after we're forgotten. And so that is immortal. And it will continue ad infinitum until either the great rip or the great crush, the great rest in peace, which is that all atoms in the universe get so far separated, so far apart that they can no longer interact, or gravity causes the universe to come down and crush down to a singularity again, and then explodes once again in another great big bang. I think most physicists think that the answer is the great rip, the great rest in peace, that atoms will finally separate from one another so much that nothing can come together again. And
well, right, with the Big Bang, there's the implied you're running as fast as you can with a big rubber band connected to you, and you get slower and slower and slower, and then you get yanked back, and then big thunderclap, Big Bang. Whereas the other one, as it continues to expand, incrementally gravity gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and so the orbits get wider, they change, and bodies are no longer subject as much proportionally to be attracted to one another to stay together. And then at some point, then they're just floating out off into space, directionless, just on whatever the last trajectory was that gravity disappeared.
So anyway, the evidence that Hubble found was that the universe is still expanding, and it's accelerating in its expansion. So there's no sign of the great crush happening anytime soon, but the big rip is quite possible. So, but I mean, I guess none of us need to worry about that. It won't happen.
Right. For example, in an astrologer reading, I won't use the 270 million year orbit of our solar system around the galactic center. It just doesn't come up, it's something that's going to go on your daily planner.
And Miles says, I'm going to die if it doesn't warm up here soon. In Calgary, it is minus 20 degrees Celsius, or minus 18 here this morning, which Tim Holmes told me yesterday that it's minus 24 in Helena, Montana. So,
wow.
For all of our fellow Americans that are in the midst of this cold snap, I wish you well and stay warm. I experienced a week like that once when I was in college, where it didn't rise above minus 33 for 1 week up in upstate New York one time. Wow. I'm sure Gunnar probably has experiences, given that he lives, is. You're not in Iceland right now, though, right, Gunnar? You're in Denmark.
Finland? Denmark?
Yeah. It's actually the coldest time I've been in Denmark since I lived here. Right.
And so maybe it's not so cold in Denmark because you're warmed by the sea, I suppose.
It's a little bit below freezing.
A little below freezing, okay. But we have stretches of the United States and Canada that are not close to the sea, and therefore they get extremely cold. So stay warm, Miles.
Wow. I mean, minus 33. I mean, at minus 33, and I don't know who proved this, but they were probably dumb. You can urinate and it'll freeze before it hits the ground.
Yeah. So, so Miles comments on my attire that sometimes I wear the purple color, which is the symbol of the combination of red and blue. And I haven't bought any shirts for a couple of years because of the pandemic, but I intend to find more purple shirts as time goes on. And the Big Cat says the repeal of Glass-Steagall Act was a GOP production. The Gramm-Leach-Billy Act was passed in the Senate with only one Democratic vote. I think you can put most of the blame on the GOP for that. Absolutely. So when Glass-Steagall was repealed, it allowed banking and investment banking and Wall Street to operate together and instead of separately. And when that happened, that caused the crash of 2008. And the consequences of it were the crash of 2008. And so, my fellow Americans who are resentful have to understand that their enemy is not politicians who are in Congress, but rather the gluttonous Wall Street that thinks that they can collect money ad infinitum. And so they got paid double on all defaulted mortgages back in 2008. And now they're gluttonously taking trillions of dollars out of the society because of the pandemic response. And until we realize that that's where our biggest problem is, we're going to be angry with the wrong people. That's the whole thing.
And there's a point there too of angry with the wrong people, mostly because if you try to chomp at the carrot they hang in front of you as a donkey, then the free lunch. Oh, look at the you'll don't follow the carrot. You make your own way, and you start to not see those tricksters that are dangled in front of you.
Right. Exactly. So anyway, we'll continue on with this this essay next week, this isn't intended as a political discussion so much as it's a discussion of the psychological situation. And as I've tried to point out, the June 6th event was purely a psychological event. And even the people that intended violence only have that intention for the reason of resentment.
Well, I resonate with the synchronicity that the current events very apropos with this text we're currently on. There's a real wonderful dovetail, and that I think the applicability of the psychology really shines forth in a very effective way that we can utilize. So it provides, I think, your good point that it's not a political show, but the political examples are clearly showing viscerally, experientially, what the text is referring to.
Right. And so the Big Cat says the enemy is unlimited big money in politics. Absolutely. And so the Japanese are smart. They don't allow election campaigns for over 3 weeks. So you get 3 weeks to have your campaign, and then you vote. And at this point, we've gotten to the point where
That's really smart. 'Cause we've
Even
gotten-
even the big money isn't effective anymore because they've pulled so much big money into the 0.1% of society that they no longer have things they can invest in, and that's a problem. And that's what they have to understand. I mean, those people who control the world, is that you have to ease up a little bit. You have to allow us to repair the highways. And
well, the 3-week period is really important because we now have a culture of re-election rather than doing things about anything. It's
Right.
always about getting reelected instead of getting reelected based on the merits of what you have completed.
That's right. And so now there's so many little green electrons sitting in Swiss banks that there's nothing for them to do to produce more. And so they
Right.
really have to go out and reinvest into society. And, and so we have to give people the way to make a living. And, the low-hanging fruit has for a long time been shovel-ready projects as
CIP, capital improvement projects.
Yeah, as Barack Obama said before 2008, and he was never allowed to do those projects because the GOP didn't allow him to do. But now we really must do, because it's very obvious that this resentment has erupted, and it's going to continue to erupt until we get a little bit smarter.
Yeah, America needs some new shoes or boots will be on the ground. I mean, that's...
Yeah. Anyway, peace.